Mitch Steele joins me to talk about yeast, non-alcoholic beer, and craft brewing. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 272. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 272, and it's late December 2022. Mitch Steele joins me this week to talk about yeast, non-alcoholic beer brewing, and craft brewing in general. Thank you to this week's sponsors, Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Are you thinking about opening your own brewery? Craft Beer and Brewing is sponsoring a brewery workshop in Fort Collins, Colorado, where you can connect with experts who have built successful breweries. The workshop runs from 26 February to 1 March 2023, and it is your opportunity to learn from the pros. For more information, visit breweryworkshop.com. Again, that's breweryworkshop.com. And Blickman Engineering has been the pioneer in nano brewing. They've helped hundreds of successful breweries achieve their dreams. You can starting with 1-barrel systems in 2006, and now they offer brew houses up to 15 barrels. They have cellaring equipment, keg washers, grain mills, and much more, sized specifically for the pro brewer. Blickman Pro systems are competitively priced, and they don't sacrifice quality. When you're ready to go pro, be sure to reach out to them for expert advice. Email them now at proseries@blickmanengineering.com. Again, that email is proseries@blickmanengineering.com. And I launched a new version of the BeerSmith forum a few months ago, as well as made some significant security upgrades. The BeerSmith discussion forum is a place where you can discuss all things brewing, including techniques, ingredients, equipment, pro brewing, and our BeerSmith recipe software. Join the conversation today at beersmith.com/forum. And now let's jump into this week's episode. Today on the show, my guest is Mitch Steele. Mitch wrote the book on IPAs called IPAs, Brewing Techniques, and the Evolution of India Pale Ale. Mitch is Chief Operating Officer and Brewmaster at New Realm Brewing Company and formerly the Brewmaster at Stone. Mitch holds a degree in fermentation science from the University of California at Davis. Mitch, it's great to have you back on the show. How are you doing?
Doing well, Brad. Thanks.
You look good. How have things been going at New Realm Brewing lately?
So we're having a pretty good year. We're growing a lot. Our restaurant side of the business is doing very well. We've got a great sales team that's out there pushing our beer, and we've signed on some interesting partnerships this year, which has really driven a lot. We partnered with Georgia Tech Athletics and are brewing a beer that is co-branded with Georgia Tech and New Realm, which is really cool.
Interesting. So are you selling at the games now or something?
Yeah, exactly. And, they have a pretty strong athletic program that goes all year. They've got basketball and baseball and, of course, football. And so it's been a fun thing to be involved with. And we brewed a Vienna lager for them. So that's something we hadn't really offered as a full-time variety for us or beer style. So that's been fun that we've been able to do that. And then we did another partnership with an Atlanta-based rock band called Blackberry Smoke, and they're a southern rock, heavily influenced by bands like Lynyrd Skynyrd and the Allman Brothers, and certainly you hear all that in their music, but they're super nice people, and we did an American lager, and it's called Blackberry Smoke Lager, which is confusing people because there's no blackberries and no smoke in it. But it's going over really well with their fan base, and we're super excited about the partnership. They've been really fun to get to know.
That's awesome. That's great.
Yeah.
How many locations are you up to now?
So we have 3 now. We had 4 going into this year. Over a couple of months ago, we shut down our Savannah location, which was unfortunate, and we didn't expect that. But there's a lot of things going on in Savannah itself with construction, and our location wasn't as strong as we thought it was. And, we were losing a lot of foot traffic because of all the street construction and building construction that was going on. And we just didn't see an end in sight for that. So, we ended up closing the restaurant, and, so we have 3. We're in Atlanta, which was our first location. We're in Virginia Beach, which is our primary production brewery. And then we have a brew pub in Charleston, South Carolina, which is doing well.
Oh, nice. That's awesome. Well, today, one of the topics you want to cover was non-alcoholic beer, which I don't think you were into before. We talked about seltzers one episode, but I don't recall you mentioning non-alcoholic beer. What drove you into that market?
Well, it's kind of interesting. We're doing some contract brewing in Virginia Beach because we had excess capacity and we wanted to try and maximize the efficiency of that brewery. And we started working with a company that sells non-alcoholic beer, and they invested in a vacuum distillation system in Virginia Beach and moved it into the building. And as part of the contract, we have the option to run our own product through that system as long as we don't impede the progress of their products, which I think is very fair. And so we are working on releasing a hazy non-alcoholic IPA, and hopefully we'll have that out by January 1st. So it's been an interesting project. I used to do a lot of non-alcoholic beer things when I was with Anheuser-Busch back in the day. We had a dialysis alcohol removal system in Fort Collins, Colorado, and we had a vacuum distillation system in Columbus, Ohio when I was there. And we came out with a beer called O'Doul's Amber that I worked on very hard. So, but It's been a long time, and seeing what's going on with non-alcoholic beers, it's crazy. We saw it a few years ago in Europe, and Europe's always taken more to non-alcoholic beers than people in the United States, who I think by and large, if they're going to drink beer, they want alcohol in it. But,
Yeah.
But you look at the success of a brewery like Athletic Brewing, and you've got to think about doing something like this, and so we're going to give it a shot.
So you're still in the early stages of it, and then I think you mentioned, there are several different methods. Obviously, it sounds like you're using a vacuum distillation method. Maybe you can describe that.
Yeah, so vacuum distillation, if you put the beer into a vessel and you create a vacuum on it, the evaporation or boiling point of the alcohol in the beer is lowered significantly when you reduce, when you pull a vacuum on it, and so you're still heating the beer just a little bit, but under a vacuum, the alcohol evaporates off and then is collected, and you're left with a product that is less than 0.5% alcohol, which is it's a pretty good system. It's capital. It's a lot of capital to invest in something like that, but it works really well. And the other systems that are out there right now that a lot of people are doing, and some of the more affordable systems are membrane filtration systems, where you create a concentration gradient and the alcohol moves across the membrane, and then the beer can be recovered from that.
So kind of a diffusion process, I guess.
Yeah. And those produce really nice non-alcoholic beverages. And then the other technique that a lot of brewers are using is there's some yeast strains out there that don't ferment maltose.
Interesting.
And yeah, so you do a beer, you make some brew house adjustments, you make it very low starting gravity, you make the terminal gravity pretty high, and then you add this yeast, and it doesn't ferment any of the maltose that you've created in the mash. So,
does that leave a lot of body in the beer, I would think, or?
Yeah, it does leave some residual sweetness, but you can balance that out with your recipe and
right.
figure it out so it's not wordy. That's the when you get the yeast contact, you get some of the ester formation and some of the other flavors that yeast provide. So it's not just wort; it tastes more like beer.
Obviously, yeah. And I mean, how has your beer? Well, I guess it hasn't made it to the community yet, but what have you? How does it taste? Are you happy with it?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting thing. I think the big takeaway for us as we started diving into this is, if you dry hop the beer, or if you're looking for hop aromatics in the base beer, none of that is going to carry through this process. So you end up with a beer that no matter how many hops you put in the beer, you're going to end up with a non-alcoholic beer that doesn't have a lot of hop character. And so you've got to start looking at things like hop extracts and things like that that you can add after you remove the alcohol. And you don't want to do regular dry hopping because you don't have the microbial protection without the alcohol. So, you don't want to add pellets or whole hops or anything like that. So the liquid hop products are kind of what we're focusing on right now.
So you're mainly using hop extract, and then of course you said you're making a hazy IPA. That must be quite challenging.
Yeah, there are some products out there that are hop based that accentuate and help form haze in the finished product, and so we're adding, so that's something that we're looking at as well.
What are some of the challenges you've run into so far making your first non-alcoholic commercial beer?
I think the overall challenge is making it taste like beer and making it taste good. And that has been a real challenge. Non-alcoholic beer without the alcohol, it's no matter what method you use, it's not going to taste like you're drinking the 6% beer. But if you can get malt hop and hop character in the beer, you're going to be much better off. And if you can get some fermentation esters and things like that, you're going to be much better off. So, just trying to figure all that out, figuring out what the base beer should be has been pretty important as well. One of the tips that I've learned in the past few months is using a lot of specialty malts in the base beer. So, because the malt character will carry over and help counteract some of the loss of flavor you get by removing the alcohol. So, just using a variety of specialty malts, even if it's a lightly colored beer, throwing in some aromatic malt or some Munich malt or, some things like that, you can help with the end flavor profile.
Are there any particular specialty malts that carry over well?
I think, like I mentioned, we've been looking at aromatic malt and malts like Special B and things like that. I think those are the kind of things you want to look at, unless you're unless you want to make a darker beer. And I will say one of the other things that I knew going in, but we've verified it more recently, is that dark beers survive the alcohol removal process a lot better than a pale beer or a hoppy beer. So running a porter or a stout through an alcohol removal process, you're going to end up with something that tastes like a porter or a stout. It's really pretty drastic how much the flavor doesn't change in those products versus, a hoppy ale or a lager.
So I guess darker roast malts really kind of hide all the flaws that you might pick up.
Yeah.
So why'd you pick a hazy IPA then? Because that seems like that would be a challenging beer to make non-alcoholic.
Yeah, we never like to do things the easy way, right? I mean, our first proposal was a porter, and we did a test batch of that, and it was really good. But we have a fairly impactful marketing and sales team, and they told us it's got to be an IPA, otherwise it's probably not worth doing. We're not going to get people to buy it.
Interesting. I mean, what just out of curiosity, what percentage of your beer that you produce now is IPAs? I know in most cases over 50%.
Yeah, I don't know if it's 50%. Well, it probably is 50%. We've seen a lot of growth in our lagers over the last couple of years. And, like I mentioned earlier, we released the Blackberry Smoke American Lager and the Georgia Tech Hella Vienna lager. So we're seeing some traction with lagers, and it's starting to creep up in our volume. So, we're probably about 50%. Our number one selling beer by far is our hazy IPA called Hazy Like a Fox.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. I have noticed the Pilsner trend, which is an interesting trend.
Yes.
It has been picking up at a lot of craft breweries, and, some of them are doing really, really good jobs with them too.
Yeah, there's a brewery here in Atlanta called Halfway Crooks that is really focused on European lager styles. So they're doing Czech lagers and German lagers and Belgian lagers, and they're very popular with the beer scene here in Atlanta. There's a couple other breweries that are doing that here as well. Round Trip is one of them, and I had the opportunity to do some traveling to Denver for the Great American Beer Festival and to Washington and Oregon for hop selection. And it was significant how many brewers, even old school brewers that made their names on hoppy ales, how many of them are doing really nice lagers? And then, you've got the breweries that are 100% focused on the European lagers with the special pour techniques and all that kind of stuff. And it's really, I think it's taking hold. People have been saying pilsners and lagers were going to be the next thing in craft, and I think that's been said for years, and it hasn't really materialized. But honestly, based on what I'm seeing, I think it's coming. I think it's really interesting. I don't think IPA will ever be supplanted as the number one style in craft beer,
right?
At least not in the near future. But I do think the prevalence of lagers is going to continue increasing, which I think is good, just because it's more variety for beer drinkers and more variety for the brewers to be able to brew.
Yeah, I mean, and the high quality craft lagers are really, really nice. And they don't taste anything like Budweiser or Michelob, So
no, they're very European focused, right?
Yeah.
And they're using European Pilsner malt and European hops, and they don't typically, most people aren't using any sort of adjuncts in them. And so, yeah, it's kind of a nice development, for somebody like me who spent 14 years brewing American lagers. It's nice to be able to brew more traditional lager styles, more German lager styles, and have some success with it. It's great.
Yeah. Well, another topic you wanted to discuss, and you were mentioning it even before the show, was the supply chain issues. We've seen some areas in the consumer side, at least, some of the supply chain problems starting to clear up. Some of the ports are starting to clear up and so on. But I know breweries are still facing a lot of serious problems. Can you walk us through some of the more significant ones at the moment?
For sure. I am the chair of the Brewers Association Supply Chain Subcommittee, and I've done that. I think I'm coming up on year 4 for that. And so I've been very heavily involved in this whole thing since COVID hit and everything that has happened since COVID. And right now, I think what's really surprising brewers, we've gone through, a couple of years of having can shortages and CO2 shortages. But right now, European malt is really problematic. And a lot of that has to do with skyrocketing energy costs in Europe and maltsters shutting down their facilities for periods at a time just to save some money on energy costs. And, shipping costs have basically doubled since 2020. And so the price of European malt is just, it's up. It's up 30 to 40%, which, if you're brewing a lager, if you're brewing a European lager or something like that, you're going to pay a lot more for your ingredients than you were paying a couple of years ago. And it's shocking, honestly. So that's one thing.
Just a side note, but I had Dr. Goller on from Best Malts a few episodes back, and he said that his energy costs alone, he's obviously in Germany, his energy costs alone went from 20% of his product to, I believe, 80% of his product price.
Wow.
His cost. So you can imagine, you can imagine what that does to your operations,
Yeah, exactly. And
not only that, he's got, the government's watching every, single ounce of gas that he spends on it too. And they're, depending on how the winter goes, they may be rationing it,
Yeah. It's really very impactful. It's impacting everybody, and people are rethinking what malts they're using in their beers and things like that. You can't readily replace those ingredients either, really, right? No, you can. It's not. You can't just substitute a lower cost malt and expect to get the same beer flavor. Malts, when you start talking specialty malts and European specialty malts, the flavor they impart on the beer is pretty critical, and so you got to be really careful with, just swapping out, German Munich for American Munich. You'd have to do a lot of trials to make sure that you can flavor match, or you just abandon flavor matching altogether. It's a tough situation.
Wow.
Yeah.
So,
but over the last,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh no, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, do you use a large portion of European malts in your various recipes?
Yeah, we do.
You do, yeah.
Yeah, we use a fair number of English malts, and we use a fair number of German malts. So, we've been looking at this from a beer cost standpoint pretty hard. Not really willing to make any changes that are going to change the flavor of our beer. Especially one that's already been successful. So, it's hard work trying to figure this out and figure out the right direction to go.
So how much? So you said 100% up in shipping, and then I have no idea what the malts have gone up, but they must have gone up 80% or more, I guess. I mean, what kind of cost impacts are you seeing?
It's about 50% for malt.
Wow.
Maybe, yeah. And that's significant. I mean, when I was buying bagged malt a few years ago, I was paying, from Europe, I was paying 55 to 75 cents a pound, and now we're at $1 a pound pretty much across the board. And things like sugars have gone up as well. So a lot of this is due to shipping costs, especially in the United States, but a lot of it is due to the energy crisis they're having in Europe right now.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
we'll see how this goes.
So what other supply chain issues have you had? Have you been impacted by CO2, for example? We had this kind of oddball thing happen with the CO2 supply. I think I said once before I think it's near Louisiana, or isn't it, or Mississippi? I can't recall.
Yeah, there's the interesting thing about CO2 that we've learned over the past few years is that beverage grade CO2 is sourced from a lot of other industries, the petroleum industry, the ethanol industry, the fertilizer industry. All those processes create CO2 that is typically sent out to a processing facility and then cleaned up for beverage use. And then the Mississippi situation, that was a natural CO2 mine that was getting contaminated. And so there's been regional shortages of CO2 and price increases on CO2. At the start of the pandemic, when nobody was driving, all the refineries got backed up, so they weren't producing anything because they had surplus material in their tanks. Same thing with the ethanol industry. The ethanol business in the Midwest produces fuel alcohol or ethanol for fuel,
right,
which got log jammed in their facilities, so they couldn't do beverage grade ethanol fermentations, for like grade neutral spirits. So a lot of the CO2 wasn't being produced by both those industries, and that created the initial shortage.
And then I assume this natural event that occurred in Mississippi probably made things worse, right?
It did. And the Southeast had been kind of unimpacted by CO2 shortages until this past summer. A lot of the breweries here in the Southeast get their CO2, at least in part, from that mine.
Right. How have these shortages and issues actually impacted your brewing?
So, during it's always something you have to keep in mind. We talked about malt and malt prices. There have been some hop shortages due to climate issues. Last year's malt crop was horrific because of extreme heat and drought in the American barley growing regions.
Interesting.
Yeah. So, I mean, we had to look at how our mash profiles last year with the malt. This year's crop is better, but it's more expensive. We've dealt with things like smoke taint and hops.
Why is that?
Well, I mean, just, last year there were a bunch of fires in Oregon and Washington, and some of the hops came in, and you don't pick it up when you do a rub of the hop.
Oh, wow.
But when you put it into a beer, then all of a sudden you're tasting smoke, and you're like, where is this coming from?
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, so that was a bit of a problem for a little while for us.
And you can't necessarily work around that real easy either, because I assume you've got contracts on the hops and so on, right?
Yeah. And the suppliers have been really good about it. If you find it and they didn't realize it, they've been pretty good about trying to take care of people that are dealing with it. I think brand mix and cans is always part of the equation. Really, what we're looking at doing, the real concrete things we're looking at doing in our breweries is conserving CO2 wherever possible. A lot of breweries are looking at converting over to nitrogen and getting nitrogen generators in their brewery, which just takes a supply of air.
And how does that work? How does nitrogen factor in here?
Well, nitrogen's an inert gas as well as, and
right.
So it doesn't impact flavor, but you can use nitrogen for blanketing cans, for example, or partial purging of bright tanks instead of using CO2 for those things. There are applications where you can use nitrogen and get the same result. And so, Allagash is the one brewery that I think has done a tremendous amount of work on this. I know there are others, but they actually did a presentation on it, and it was pretty enlightening. And then just going through the brewery and evaluating your CO2 usage, because right now, I think up until this point, you just use CO2, and it was just like this endless spigot of CO2, and now people are really thinking about how they're using CO2 and whether it's the most efficient way.
Has anybody started doing anything about harvesting CO2 from fermentation or?
Yeah, and that's been really interesting because over the years, in my time at Stone, we looked at getting a CO2 recovery system at Stone several times, and we could never justify it on an ROI basis. It was just so expensive, and now there are companies that are making lower cost CO2 recovery systems, and they're still expensive, but it's not. Instead of it being $600,000 to $750,000, it's more like $100,000 to $150,000.
Oh wow!
And so that for some breweries, that's within their capital budget, and they can do it. We're not there yet, but it certainly is something we're talking about.
Interesting. And then I think you mentioned packaging has been a concern. I think going back several years now, right?
Yeah, when the whole world shut down, and one of the impacts of that was all the on-premise or bars and restaurants that served our beer and served everybody's beer stopped operating, right? And so every brewer that could pivoted over to producing a lot more cans, and so the demand for cans outpaced the supply pretty significantly, and that was compounded by the fact that energy drinks and things like that are growing at a tremendous rate as well. So there just weren't enough cans to go around, and so one of the things that happened was a lot of brewers started looking internationally at can supplies instead of getting American-made cans. Well, the potential problem with that is the liners that are on the inside of the can that protect the beer from coming in contact with the aluminum.
They all have plastic liners, basically, right?
Yeah, they were using different formulations for these liners, and some of them didn't work with beer and the lower pH of beer. And so it was, people were having liners dissolve in their beer and developing these weird sulfur flavors and everything else. And so, this was another thing that we worked on the supply chain subcommittee, was just understanding what brewers should be looking at when they're sourcing cans and how to test it and how to make sure their beer's going to hold up okay in the can. And that was really, really very interesting. But, one of the biggest can suppliers in the United States announced earlier this year that they were only going to deal with brewers that could buy 5 truckloads at a time, which is about 1 million cans.
Wow.
And that puts about 90% of the breweries in this country out of the equation for those cans. So those kind of things are happening. There's economic pressures everywhere, and a lot of it, the domino effect or the cascade effect is very real.
Well, anything more on supply chain issues that we didn't cover?
No, it's hopefully, as things kind of settle out. Yeah, inflation and supply chain are both big impacts on the brewing business right now. And, it's, a lot of breweries are struggling to figure out how to continue making money, honestly.
Inflation's hitting every business. I mean, it really
is.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's awful.
Well, back to brewing. You
Yep.
mentioned you've been working with some of the new yeast strains, including some of those that are thiol active. These are obviously intended to bring out a lot of the fruity IPA flavors. What's your experience been with those?
So we've had a lot of fun with it. There's a yeast company that's been doing these what they call gene edited yeast strains.
Right.
And if you look at several years ago, the research into hops was uncovering the fact that these sulfur compounds called thiols
Yeah.
were more intensely aromatic than any other, than the oils or anything else in the hop that people have been focusing on for the last 25 years. And so people started researching these thiols, and one of the things that came out of this was the fact that there's a lot of thiol material in hops and in malt that is just bound up with malt or hop compounds and don't ever get let loose in the brewing process. And a couple of these yeasts have enzymes in them that free up those thiols. And so I'll give you a good example. We're coming out with a beer in January called Psychedelic Rabbit IPA.
Mm-hmm.
And it's pretty much a West Coast IPA recipe. It's got Citra, it's got Cascade, it's got cashmere hops in it. You'd
Nice.
expect a beer like that to be very citrus forward and everything.
Yeah.
But when we use this yeast in it, it immediately goes into passion fruit and pineapple, and the tropical intensity on this thing is off the charts. So, we're struggling with what to call this beer. We don't want to call it a West Coast IPA because it doesn't have that piney, citrusy character.
Right.
But it's not a hazy IPA either. But it's incredibly tropical, and it's been a lot of fun to play with these. There's a company called Omega Yeast Labs that does Star Party and Cosmic Punch, and they're coming out with more all the time. And we've had a lot of fun with that. I think what's happening, I think with yeast right now is fascinating because I think it's coming to the same level of discussion that hops have been for the last 20 years and hop varieties. And I think people, brewers are latching onto this because you can get different flavors in your beer with different yeasts. And, we've always known that, but, people didn't talk about yeast much. But now that there's all these new yeast strains available, it's becoming more important and a bigger part of the conversation when you're talking about your beers.
Yeah, I think even some of the Omega yeasts are available at the homebrew level. Are you using them during active fermentation, or are you using them dry hopping, or how are you best using these yeasts?
So we're using them for the entire fermentation.
But I should have said, are you hopping during active fermentation? I guess I said that wrong. Yeah.
So a little bit. I think one of the things that we learned from the supplier from Omega is that mash hopping really accentuates some of the biotransformation processes, and so this beer we're mash hopping with it, which I think, which I've never been, sold on it being a real advantage for brewers to do.
It always seemed kind of ridiculous to me that you'd put hops in the mash and then go ahead and boil them after that and then expect them to do anything. But can you explain what's going on here, maybe?
Well, I don't understand the chemistry. I haven't seen what the chemistry is, but something happens during the mashing process with the thiols and the hops that make them accessible to this yeast enzyme. And so you add the yeast and you do the primary fermentation, and within a day, 24 hours into the fermentation, you're developing a really intense tropical fruit character. And so we're exploring whether a beer like this needs to have a mid-fermentation dry hop anymore. We haven't gotten that far with it yet, but that is a question we are asking ourselves.
Yeah. I would assume are you doing that, or what are you doing on the one that you're producing?
So right now it's got a very low level mid fermentation dry hop.
Okay, so it
just
does.
because, but I mean it's not anywhere near the level that we're doing in our hazy like a fox hazy IPA.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And but you had good results with the new yeast, right?
Yeah, we've enjoyed it. It's the beer's great. People are excited about it, and the company's been great to work with. That supplies the yeast, and they've been very helpful. So
Hmm.
it's been a it's for somebody who's done a lot of innovation work over my career, this has been incredibly fun.
Yeah. Yeah. Now I think you've been playing with some of the new Norwegian and Finnish yeast strains as well, which are rather forgiving, if I recall.
Yeah, there's we've trialed three of them so far. We've done the Kvike Voss and Harnendal, and we've done juicy, hazy pale ales with those. And then we've been working a lot with the Lutra strain, which is a very clean fermenter, even at higher temperatures. And you can do beers that are very lager-like
Hmm.
with that yeast strain, and so we've been playing around with all of them. We don't have anything full time. We did a beer with the Voss strain over the summer called T Flex. It was a double IPA with Southern Hemisphere hops, and it was, the Norwegian yeast adds a lot of pineapple character. One of the things that we learned over the years is, these yeasts are touted as being able to go up to 95 degrees Fahrenheit or so when the fermentation. But we found for a hoppy beer style, we like the flavor profile better if we cap that at about 85 degrees
Mm-hmm.
Fahrenheit, which is still significantly higher
That's
than
still
a
pretty
normal
warm.
ale
Yeah.
fermentation. But it doesn't get, it tends to, what we've seen is that yeast tends to go kind of funky or kind of Belgian-y when you get real high in the temperature range. So
Huh.
we just dialed that back a bit and allowed the hops to shine a bit more.
So, I mean, how are you incorporating those in brewing? Are you allowing, you're just letting the fermenter free rise there or what?
Yeah, we chill to something like 75 degrees and then allow it to free rise to 85 and then control the temperature. And yeah, even with us keeping the temperature limited to 85 degrees Fahrenheit, the fermentation is like 3 days.
Yeah, they're very fast. And
Yeah.
I'm surprised you're making IPAs with them, huh?
Yeah, we haven't. Yeah, we did an IPA. It was fun. It really was. It had all this, you know, Australian and New Zealand tropical fruit character and dankness, but then the yeast just added, with the yeast added, just complemented those hop characters really nicely.
Huh.
But for the most part, we've stuck with lower alcohol beers, like pale ales and things like that.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. But you've had good results overall with the various
Yeah.
strains? Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's been, again, it's, this whole yeast thing is coming into a new era, and it's really been a lot of fun to understand how the flavors of your beer can change when you just change up the yeast strain.
Have you played at all with any of the new souring strains? There's some strains now that, all in one shot will sour the beer and also ferment it.
Yeah, we have.
You have?
Yeah, we've done a lot of work with those. We've released a lot of beers that were fermented with either Philly Sour or Sour VCA.
Uh-huh.
It's a very clean acid production. It drops the pH down to about 3.2, 3.3, somewhere in that range, versus 4.3 to 4.5 in a regular beer.
That's quite low. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a very clean lactic acid. One of the things that we found is that with certain beers, it's better to do a blend. So you do a portion of the beer with the souring yeast, and you do a portion of the beer with just a standard ale yeast, and then you blend the two together for the end product. And that kind of tempers the sourness a little bit and makes it a little more palatable. But there are other sour styles.
If you're driving the pH that low, it's got to be pretty sour, right?
It's pretty sour, yeah. And it depends on the style of beer and what you're brewing. But we were doing a series of kettle sours for a few years, and we started trialing some of the releases with these yeasts, and they were very well received. So it's been, again, that's been fun. It's been a lot of fun.
You're always trying new things.
Yeah, try to.
Yeah. So, we talked about Pilsners being a trend in craft brewing. What other trends are you seeing at the moment?
Well, There are people that are saying that old school beer styles are coming back just across the board, and that pale ales are coming back, and West Coast IPAs are coming back.
Hmm.
People are maybe getting tired of the hazy thing. You know, uh, I don't know if I see that yet, but just lower alcohol beers are something that is starting. I think that's something that's starting to take hold a little bit as well. There are a couple of breweries here that do really nice beers that are below 4% alcohol, and as people get older, and I'm speaking for myself, I I don't chase after the big double IPAs anymore. I still like to taste them, but if I'm going to drink a beer, I'm going to go for something with a little bit lower alcohol so I can have more than one.
Well, yeah,
And
and you want to be able to drive too. So
and
yeah,
and yeah, the driving piece is part of it, and just being functional, and all that kind of stuff. Uh, so I it's kind of neat to see that breweries, at least in our area, are having some success with doing sessionable beers and lagers. And there's a pub here in Atlanta that has opened an English cask bar as part of their
hmm.
facility. They have two levels of drinking. They've got a Belgian beer bar, they've got a kind of a main bar, and then in one corner of the upstairs area, they've done it up like a British pub with 4 beer engines, and they're pouring cask beer all the time, and it's been
So
very
the
popular.
hand pumps and everything.
Oh yeah,
That's
yeah,
awesome.
it's been great.
Yeah, I had some of those in London. It was quite enjoyable. But um,
Yeah.
go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh no, I was going to say I was just in London a few weeks ago, and that's always one of my joys, is to get real ale there,
Yeah, yeah.
and just taste them. And they're unfortunately they're kind of dying in England. They're really fading away, which is just a shame. I used to go into these pubs in London, and there'd be 4 or 5 real ales on, and now there's
Yeah,
2.
yeah.
That kind of thing, and it's like, boy, that's no good.
It is hard. I know the public houses there are facing tremendous pressures again because of inflation and energy and all the other things we talked about. So
Yeah. Yeah, it's hitting
hopefully some
everybody.
of them survive.
I hope so. I hope
Yeah.
so. The tradition is amazing, and I never like to lose sight of the importance of the traditional styles.
Yeah. Well, obviously, there's a bit of a shakeout in the aftermath of the pandemic, particularly in the craft brewing area. I know there's a lot of breweries I worked with that have closed down now. How have the
Yeah.
surviving breweries adapted to the new craft beer environment?
So I think streamlining their offerings has been important, because distributors don't want to carry a whole bunch of beers that they can't focus on a 30 brand portfolio, for example. So streamlining the offerings, focusing on the beer costs and brewery efficiencies has been a big part of it. Um, looking to see if you can move lower cost beers, which is kind of happening with the lager thing, on its own, without people really forcibly driving it. It's just what people are, a lot of beer drinkers are drinking right now. So that has helped a bit. Um, trying to, combine forces, small breweries combining forces for shipping, for ingredient purchases, things like that, where you get a little bit more buying power and can maybe get a price break here or there. All those things are things that people are doing.
Yeah, I've noticed, this is just anecdotal, but even at the grocery store now, it seems to me there's just kind of fewer choices available. I don't know if that's
Yeah.
just because everybody's competing for space or what, but I've just noticed in the last couple months that it just seems to be fewer options.
Yeah, I've noticed that too. And I think, if you look at the price increases you're seeing in grocery stores, it's paralleling, what's going on with beer. And with beer, it's a little more difficult to just raise your beer prices, because distributors, if you're trying to sell a beer for $1 more a 6-pack than somebody else's beer that's comparable, you're going to run into problems. And so it's got to be, typically craft brewers follow the lead of bigger brewers on price increases. So when bigger brewers increase prices, then craft brewers will take a look and say, okay, maybe it's time for us to increase our price too.
Yeah, I mean, one odd thing I've noticed is that the prices for beer haven't gone up that much.
No,
for craft
not
beer,
yet.
really not. And I mean, like if I go buy I don't know, 6-pack of soda, the price is almost doubled.
Yeah.
And yet a 6-pack of beer, maybe it's $1 more. It hasn't gone up, dramatically, which is kind of surprising.
Yeah, it is. And I think that's just because of the dynamics of the industry, and nobody wants to be the highest cost brand out there. So everybody's waiting for somebody else to make the first move.
Yeah. It's just interesting that, I haven't seen it go up as most of the groceries have. I mean, a lot of the groceries are up 30, 40, even 100% in some cases.
Yeah, don't even get me started on the cost of meat.
I know.
Absolutely
it's just
ridiculous.
Shocking to me. It's, anyways, Mitch, thank you so much for coming. I wanted to get your closing thoughts on all the topics we talked about today.
Yeah, I think, with everybody struggling with inflation and everything that's going on, I think throwing some love to your local breweries is really something that pays dividends. Keeping these people afloat, if you can, by supporting them, is going to be really important in the coming years. And look for some of this innovations, that's coming out. A lot of brewers are diving into these ingredients and really trying to make interesting beers, and they want your feedback. I know we do, and I know most brewers appreciate it when they hear back from the people drinking their beer, whether it's good or bad. And hopefully brewers can continue to support the communities they're in and home brewing and things like that. It's just we're in a tough rut right now, and if things go well, we'll climb out of it like we always do. But yeah, it's a bit tough right now.
Yeah, I mean, we discussed before the show, even home brewing has been in kind of a slump for good 8 years now. So it's been challenging,
Yeah, a lot of younger people aren't drinking beer, and I think that is something that we're actively working on. Be it start making things that they'll want to drink, or education, or whatever. It'd be great if for breweries, it would be great if people stopped drinking seltzer and stopped drinking ready to drink cocktails and started drinking beer again.
Yeah. Well, Mitch, I appreciate you coming on the show. I know I called you short notice, but you stepped up as you always do, and really appreciate you taking time out of your busy day to be with us.
Well, thanks, Brad. It's always fun to talk to you.
And today my guest was Mitch Steele, the author of the book IPAs and also brewmaster at New Realm Brewing Company. Mitch, thank you once again.
Thank you.
A big thank you to Mitch Steele for joining me this week. Thanks also to Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. If you want to start your own brewery, join them in Colorado for their brewery workshop, where you can connect with experts who have built successful breweries. To sign up, go to breweryworkshop.com. Again, that's breweryworkshop.com. And Blickman Engineering has been the pioneer of nano brewing, and they've helped hundreds of successful breweries achieve their dreams. Starting with one barrel systems back in 2006, they now offer brew houses up to 15 barrels. They have cellaring equipment, keg washers, grain mills, and much more. Blickman Pro systems are competitively priced, and they don't sacrifice your quality. When you're ready to go pro, be sure to reach out to them. Email them now at proseries@blickmanengineering.com. Again, that's proseries@blickmanengineering.com. And I launched a new version of the BeerSmith discussion forum a few months back, as well as made some significant security upgrades. The BeerSmith discussion forum is a place where you can discuss all things brewing, including techniques, ingredients, equipment, pro brewing, and our BeerSmith recipe software. Join the conversation today at beersmith.com/forum. I'd like to thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great brewing week.